What I'm going to try to do today is to sort of summarize what happened to Paul between his address to the Ephesian elders and when he appears as a prisoner before Felix. Our lesson today is Paul before Felix in Acts 24, but it leaves out a good bit of material. Last time our study together was on Paul's speech before the Ephesian elders. Chapter 20 of the book of Acts ends by saying, when he, Paul, had said these things, he knelt down and prayed with them all, and they began to weep aloud and embraced Paul and repeatedly kissed him, grieving especially over the word which he had spoken, that they would not see his face again. And so Paul didn't expect to ever get back to Ephesus. When he leaves the city on the third missionary journey, he has called for the elders at Ephesus to come over to Miletus and to talk with him. Miletus was a very famous town among the Greeks. It was nearly as big as Ephesus. Trying to figure out demographics, how many people lived in a given city in the ancient world, is a near impossibility. But most people think that cities like Ephesus and Corinth and Thessalonica had around 150,000 people. And that's a good number to start with. I see sometimes numbers like 500,000, which I think is really outrageous. I don't think that many people would have lived behind the wall of an ancient city. When Paul left Miletus, it was in company, presumably, with the 7 men that are mentioned in Acts the 20th chapter, who accompanied him to take this collection that he had been taking up, to take it to Jerusalem. Now, as I've said before, there is nothing in the book of Acts, or only one time in the book of Acts, where something is said about the collection. My own theory is that Luke did not mention the collection because it was not accepted in Jerusalem, because it was a kind of embarrassment. Paul had collected this money from the Gentile churches to help the poor of Jerusalem, and then the high priest and their party had refused to allow it to be distributed. And so it was, from that standpoint at least, never a project that Paul could say that he had carried through on. But the ship that he was on after he left Ephesus, he had not, or after he left Miletus, he had called for the elders at Ephesus to come to Miletus because he didn't want to miss his boat. The captain might arbitrarily decide to leave whenever he chose, and Paul wanted to be sure and be on hand. He was trying to get to Jerusalem by the Feast of Pentecost. To be there, presumably people came from other parts, Christians came from other parts of the Greco-Roman world too, on the day of Pentecost, since it was an annual celebration, you might say, of the beginning of the church in Acts 2. Well, Paul is accompanied by Luke. The we sections are very apparent in this portion of the book of Acts. So Luke was apparently also in their company. And he says that when they left Miletus, they came to Kos. Kos is a small island, relatively speaking, off the coast of Asia Minor. It's, if you can picture Turkey today on the map, there being a rough corner as the sea turns it was going south, the sea turns to the east. So Paul comes to Kos. As I said, the island was famous in the ancient world because it is where Hippocrates, the great famous physician, taught and healed people. At Kos, in those early, there was three principal sites. To say that he healed there, that he practiced there, is to say that there was a large Asclepian temple to Asclepius the god, who was in charge of healing according to the mythology. And so Paul would have stopped there at Kos, and then the ship he was on went on down to Rhodes. Rhodes is the largest island of those along the coast there of Turkey. And so he put in there, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world was also at Kos, the giant of Rhodes, who is, according to the descriptions, is long since has perished. But according to the descriptions, he had 1 foot on one side of the harbor and 1 foot on the other side of the harbor, and the ships that came into the harbor at Rhodes passed underneath his legs. But so Rhodes was a famous place, controlled most of the time by the Greek government that was reigning in Egypt at the time. The ship then went on from there to the coast of Asia at a place called Patara, and I don't really know anything that Patara was famous for, other than being a place where ships would dock and took off. And so Paul came there. They changed ships, and he went toward Syria, toward Jerusalem, toward Caesarea, on the ship that they got on. The book of Acts says that the island of Cyprus passed them on the left, which would mean that they took out to the open sea and cut off a big corner as they went south of Cyprus. They came to the city of Tyre. Tyre is a fascinating place to me. There are three long chapters in Ezekiel that are given to Tyre. Ezekiel was going to be utterly destroyed, according to Ezekiel. And it was, of course, by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great hadn't lived at the time of Ezekiel. And so the city of Tyre had been destroyed, had been completely destroyed, but largely rebuilt. Today, I am told, I've never been to Tyre, but I'm told that the causeway that Alexander built from the seacoast over to the island is still very much visible. And so Alexander conquered the city of Tyre, which had been thought to be unconquerable by many of the people of the ancient world. But Paul got permission to go and to visit the church that was in Tyre, and they stayed about a week there while the ship was being unloaded. It was going to Tyre. And so they stayed there a few days and then went on down to Ptolemais. It's the only mention of Ptolemais in Scripture, although it was an important city, especially for the Egyptians. The Egyptians mentioned it, 1,000, 2,000 years beforehand, before these incidents, at least, were dealing with in the life of Paul. Well, he went on down to the coast of Caesarea. The Bible had said when Philip was teaching the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts the 8th chapter, it had said that Philip went on his way to Caesarea, and he stayed in that area. He may have already been married, but at any rate, it says in the book of Acts that he had 4 daughters who prophesied. And of course, it's gotten a great deal of discussion. What does it mean to prophesy? Well, they apparently spoke in public, but they were inspired people. And so Philip is mentioned. It's the second time we've come across. This is Philip the evangelist in Acts, the 8th chapter, not Philip the apostle, who is dead by now, by several years. But Paul stays for some time in Caesarea. Felix is the governor, and while they are there, the prophet Agabus shows up. Now, Agabus we've already been introduced to him in the 11th chapter of Acts, but he took Paul's belt girdle, it says, and bound himself, the prophet bound himself, his hands and then made a prophecy that the person who owned that belt was going to go to Jerusalem and be imprisoned there. And Paul had been warned all along that that was going to happen to him when he got to Jerusalem, but he ignored the warnings and went to Jerusalem anyway. There's a good description of the trip to Jerusalem in Acts, toward the end of the 20th chapter, and into chapter 21. When he got to Jerusalem, there was a conclave, the people of the church in Jerusalem, the elders of the church, and particularly James, brother of the Lord, is mentioned. And so they have a meeting. Paul presumably handed over to them the money that he'd collected, although there isn't anything said about it. But James does say, do you see all these thousands of people? Remember, it was the Feast of Pentecost. And so James says to him, do you see all these thousands of people? They are all zealous for the law and believers. He uses the word believers and zealous for the law. In my opinion, there was a strong element in the church in the early days, say between the time the church was established, somewhere 30 to 33, and Paul's death in the mid-60s. There was a strong element in the church who believed that to be a Christian was just another way of being a Jew. So like there were Pharisee Jewish Christians and Sadducee Jewish Christians, there was a considerable party that wanted Christianity to be just another sect of the Jews. And of course Paul would not allow that. Paul demanded that Gentile converts not have the Sabbath laid on them, the observance of the Sabbath or circumcision or the various traditions that the Jews had. And so James advises Paul to overcome the gossip that was going around about him by being in charge for some people who had presumably taken something like the kind of law, Mosaic, what is the law? Mazarite, taken a Mazarite vow. And so while he is with these people being in charge for them, a week has to pass by. And Paul has been into the temple to purify himself and get ready to offer an offering at his own charge for the people that had this vow. Presumably it was a vow that had been specified by the law, a Nazarite vow. A Nazarite vow. I'll get it right here. But while he was in the temple, some of the Jews recognized him, and they thought that he was trying to destroy Judaism by converting people to Judaism, but not requiring of them that they obey the ethnic elements, at least, in the law of Moses. And so there is a riot in the temple. It is interesting, but that the Temple Mount, was built right up on the corner of the high point of the city of Jerusalem, and to the north of the temple, there was a large fortification that the Romans occupied. The Jews forbid anybody other than Jews to be in the temple area itself under threat of death. But they could, the Romans could walk along the top of the wall and look down into the temple. It didn't matter if they looked down in the temple. What they couldn't do was to go inside the temple. And there was a riot surrounding Paul, and they were trying to tear him limb from limb. And somebody reported it to Claudius Lysias, who was the tribune in charge of the Roman soldiers that were stationed there. And there is some remains of that fortification left today. It was the fortress of Antonio, they say. It's called the fortress of Antonio. But, of course, that's Mark Antony. This fortification, this Roman fortification, was named after him. Now, in today's time, what is called the Via Dolorosa, most of us have seen that, at least some pictures of it, during the time of the Passover feast, or when Jesus rose from the dead, when he was crucified. Like I said, we know when Jesus died and when he was raised from the dead around the Passover time. At least we know the season of the year. We don't know which Passover it was. The scholars argue over that as to whether it was 30, 31, 32, 33 A.D. But Paul was charged for these men who had a vow on themselves, and he had purified himself, and then suddenly this riot began. Well, Claudius Lysias led some soldiers out into the court of the Gentiles and was shoving back people, trying to deliver Paul. And while they were getting ready, while they were going up the steps from the wall where they would proceed over to their quarters, while they were going up the step, Paul said to the Roman tribune, spoke to him in Greek. Well, he was shocked because Paul could speak Greek. Greek was the cultivated language of the time, and it would be a mark of Paul's education and background if he spoke Greek. He seems to have spoken Greek well. And so Claudius Lysias said, fine, you're apparently not who I thought you were, but why don't you address this mob? And so Paul began to speak in them in Aramaic. Well, he was at least bilingual, he at least had 2 languages, and he may have spoken many more. The languages over the Greco-Roman world was sort of like in Europe today. You pass over a border of some kind or another, and there's a different language spoken. And so Paul went ahead, was at charge, but when he got through, this is in Acts, it's in Acts 21, verse 7. I'm forgetting the verse, where the Acts 22, verse 7, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized. Paul tells of his own conversion in Acts chapter 22. Of course, it was given in the third person earlier in the book of Acts, when Jesus actually appeared to him, when he was persecuting the Christians. And now there is a recount where Paul himself recounts what happened to him on the road to Damascus. And that's in chapter 22. And he says, in chapter 22 it says, that Ananias came to him, preached to him, told him that God had chosen him to preach to the Gentiles. And Ananias says, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins. So it's a passage that shows us the steps between being a Gentile or a Jew and being a Christian was to be baptized into Christ. Well, Paul was baptized, of course, at Damascus. Several years had passed, and now he is in Jerusalem. But when Paul got to the part where he spoke about Jesus, the riot broke out again, and Claudius Lysias had to have some of his soldiers lift Paul up and carry him up the stairs to his own quarters. And then he gave orders that Paul be whipped so he could find out what the truth was. The Romans didn't trust anybody. You had to be tortured ahead of time if you were going to give a testimonial. And Paul said, is it lawful for you to do this? Not to Claudius Lysias. Claudius Lysias had gone to some other part. But he said, is it lawful for you to beat a person like me? I'm a Roman citizen. Well, the word was taken to Claudius Lysias, the tribune, and it was told him, of course, that Paul was a Roman citizen. And so Claudius Lysias made plans for Paul to take Paul out of the city of Jerusalem and get him back to Caesarea, where he would be under the charge of Felix. And so that account is given in the book of Acts as Paul is taken. First of all, he appears before the Jewish high priest, and he pits the Pharisees against the Sadducees, and they get into an argument. And so Claudius Lysias makes plans for him to get out of town. And he is taken to Caesarea, which was really where the governor would normally be stationed. Pontius Pilate was apparently in Jerusalem because of the feast of Passover or of Pentecost. And he probably spent his time in Caesarea because it was a nice Roman town that Herod the Great had built not too long before. And so Paul comes to Caesarea, and it is his speech at Caesarea, that is our subject today. In chapter 24 of the book of Acts, when Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul answered, "Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation," the "you" is Felix, of course, and he says, "Many years you've been a judge of this nation. You can ascertain," Paul says, "you can ascertain that it is no more than 12 days that I went up to Jerusalem. All the things that I'm charged with I couldn't have done in 12 days. And Paul, in the process of talking to Felix, says, "Now after many years I come to bring alms and offerings to my nation." That's in Acts 24, verse 17. And it's the only time in Acts that there is a reference to the collection that Paul was taking up. It's such an important thing in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, and in Romans 15. The collection that he's taking up was obviously to Paul a very important part of his missionary work. And it's strange that Acts should say virtually nothing about it. But that one statement in Acts 24:17 is the only reference to the collection that there is. Well, Paul defends himself before Felix. And Felix says to him, "When Claudius Lysias comes down, I'll ask more things from him and try to find out what the real charges of substance are that you have against you," he says to Paul. And so Felix puts Paul in prison. He gives charge to his soldiers that anybody who wanted to visit Paul were free to do that. And so Paul could have visitors coming and going. But it adds that Felix hoped that he would get some bribe money too. And so Felix kept Paul there in prison for 2 years. And it may be that during that 2-year period of time he wrote the prison epistles. I personally think there's better evidence that he wrote them in Rome. But there are some people that think that he did write the prison epistles, Philemon and Colossians and Ephesians and Philippians, that he wrote those letters from imprisonment at Caesarea. But at the end of that 2 years, there was a change in the governorship, and Felix was deposed, sent off to Gaul into exile, and a new governor came on the post named Festus. And our next lesson is on Paul. It's when Paul is preaching or talking to Festus that he appeals to Rome and says that he's a Roman citizen. and but that will be next week. But we haven't really said much about his speech before Felix, but he does not recount his conversion here. He has recounted it in Acts 22, and he will again in Acts 26 when he talks to Festus and Agrippa. Agrippa the king is there when Festus is there. Felix was married to a Jewish woman. It says that in Acts, to a Jewish woman named Drusilla. Paul is simply kept in prison with visitation rights for 2 years while he's waiting. I wonder what he's waiting. Claudius Lysias never does give Felix information that would justify the release of Paul. So Paul stayed there until he appealed to Caesar, and he goes across the Mediterranean Sea. But we'll get into that. We only have 2 more lessons to go in the book of Acts and Paul's coverage in the book of Acts. Thank you for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing most of you at the old congregation this afternoon. I suppose it'll be this afternoon by the time you see it. Thank you again. Good night.